Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. Follow the link in the description to pre-order a copy of the book so you'll be the first to receive it on the date of September 1st, 2022. The Outdoor Minimalist Podcast has a goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 19, we are going to be discussing the topic of hunting, which this is the first time we are talking about this on the show. I've done 2 episodes already about fly fishing, so if you're a sportsman and you're interested in those types of things, I would check out episode 10 and episode 18. In creating this podcast, I honestly was pretty unsure about adding activities like hunting and fishing into the content plan because they're not sports that I do myself, and they're not necessarily sports that I would align with my life. But I thought within the Outdoor Minimalist mission, it's a missed opportunity if we didn't include this huge sector of the outdoor industry within the podcast and the book. Sportsmen contribute immensely to things like conservation of our wild spaces, and I think that discussing how hunting can help individuals feel more connected to the land is important. Not only that, but it seems to me that the number of people getting involved in outdoor recreation is only increasing. But at the same time, it kind of seems like the number of people entering the sport of hunting is kind of diminishing. And I don't really have hard data on this statement. It's just kind of my opinion, but these are observations that I've made integrating and networking within the outdoor industry. So I could very well be wrong. So if you have the data on this, let me know. Anyway, whether you grew up hunting or are simply intrigued by the activity, this episode will give you a brief introduction to how hunting can bring people together, build deeper connections to nature, and help you maintain a more sustainable lifestyle. Although I grew up in rural Minnesota, where hunting is simply a part of almost everyone's life, I no longer participate in that activity, and I don't honestly really know that much about it anymore. And since accessibility and know-how go a long way in the world of hunting, I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Kalli Hawkins. Kalli Hawkins is an outdoor gear and adventure writer based in a small northern Minnesota town near the border of Canada. She grew up hunting and fishing in northern Minnesota and continued her passion for the outdoors throughout her life and years spent living in Colorado. Her work appears on Teton Sports, Outside Business Journal, Cleanup News, and many others. Before we get to the interview, just a short reminder that The Outdoor Minimalist is releasing a Patreon. So if you go to theoutdoorminimalist.com, you can find all the deets on what the Patreon is. But if you are interested in it, there are 2 tiers. There's a $5 and $10 tier, which is a monthly payment. I might also think of doing a one-time listener support payment if you just want to donate to the podcast but don't necessarily want to do a monthly subscription to the exclusive bonus episodes, Q&As, and early releases of episodes. So all of that content will start to be released on Monday, February 7th. If you go to theoutdoorminimalist.com, you will see that the Patreon is active and you can sign up already, but I decided just to do that during the launch month so people could see what I am offering for the Patreon itself. Check it out. Let me know what you think. If there are other things you think would be cool to see on there, I would love to know. And like I said before, new content will be available starting Monday, February 7th. So thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show, Kalli. I'm excited to dive into, I guess, the life of a sportswoman. But before we get started, can you tell me a little bit more about your passion for outdoor recreation and how you got to where you are today?
Thanks for having me on, Megan. This is really awesome. I've been a big fan of your podcast since you've kind of kickstarted it here. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a small town in northern Minnesota called Grand Marais, and it's about 30 minutes from the Canadian border. And I grew up spending the majority of my childhood in the outdoors. That was hunting and fishing and canoeing and hiking, kind of all the above outdoor activities. And I would say it all started with my father. He worked for the U.S. Forest Service throughout my childhood. He worked for the government organization for 17 years and was an avid outdoorsman and kind of passed down his passion for the outdoors to my brothers and I. So that was kind of the initial start of kind of how I was exposed to the outdoors and to hunting and fishing. I'll kind of dive into that a little bit deeper, but I've maintained that same passion throughout my life and through my time in Colorado. And I lived out in Colorado for about 10 years and recently moved back home to Grand Marais, Minnesota. So it's been a big part of my life, and it's something I care about, and it's something I've kind of expanded on professionally and academically through my schooling. I graduated with a geography degree with a minor in sustainability. After that, kind of broke into writing about the outdoor industry and gear and conservation and outdoor education. And it's something that I truly love, and that's something I'm passionate about. So it's kind of my quick background, I would say.
Very cool. Yeah, Kalli and I actually met each other because we're both freelance writers in the outdoor industry. So that is a fun connection. And
yeah.
I also grew up in Minnesota, but I don't live there anymore. But I'm obsessed with northern Minnesota, so I go back every year to do something just because the summers up there are so beautiful.
Yeah, it's northern Minnesota, and just Minnesota in general it's such a special place. I truly love it. And it's just easy access to the outdoors at all times. I mean, I can drive 10 minutes from my house now and, be on a lake by myself or have a trailhead to myself. And I just love it. So I've really, really enjoyed being back home in Minnesota.
That's awesome. You touched a little bit on how you were first exposed to hunting, I guess, through your father and your family. But what type of hunting do you specifically do today? And fishing, I guess.
Yeah, so I started out being exposed to hunting, by my father, and he would go out whitetail deer hunting here in northern Minnesota and fishing, and he also did bird hunting kind of out in North Dakota at times. And so he'd come home with deer and ducks and geese and all sorts of stuff, and it was kind of a family event, kind of helping him essentially process the animal. And so that was kind of my first time being exposed, to hunting. Starting out, I wasn't necessarily just because I was exposed to it. I wasn't comfortable around it per se. I grew up initially wanting to be a veterinarian, wanting to help animals. And so it was kind of this weird thing, that my dad's coming home with animals and I wanted to fix them. That kind of stuck with me for a while, but it was about at 15 years old that I went out on my first whitetail hunt with my father and my younger brother. And that's kind of where I would say my personal hunting experience kind of stemmed from, was that at 15 years old. And so we all three went out, and I was up in the tree stand and my brother and my dad were down at the base. And just because I was out there didn't mean that I necessarily was ready. There's a lot of weight behind hunting, and there's a lot of kind of have to have some humility and compassion. And so I just necessarily wasn't ready that day. My brother actually took my buck that had walked out, but I just needed an extra couple days. And so my father and I went back out the day or two after, and then I got my first deer, and that was a doe. And that's I was hooked right after that. And it's something that I've continued to do throughout my life. Out in Colorado, it's a little bit different style of hunting than the Midwest. Mm-hmm. It's not, stationary where you're sitting in a tree stand necessarily. It's up mountains and chasing after deer, elk, and a little bit different style, I would say. And so I've done an elk hunt out in Colorado. I've done a mule deer hunt. That was 3 years ago, and that was successful. I got a mule deer out in Colorado, and then I've done some grouse hunting out in Colorado as well. So a little bit different variety of hunting and a little bit different style than the Midwest here in Minnesota, but been great so far, and I truly love it. So.
Yeah, there are so many different styles of hunting, and so your primary one is the whitetail deer, but so I grew up in southern Minnesota, so kind of on the plains. So do you do any pheasant hunting or duck hunting, bird hunting of any kind?
I personally haven't myself, but it's something I've always wanted to try. I just think going pheasant hunting would just be so much fun. And especially if, using dogs and bird dogs would be just a treat. I know my father has, and he's done multiple. I've had friends who have done that as well. I personally just haven't. I've done grouse hunting here in Minnesota and then also in Colorado, but not kind of similar style to out in the plains and prairies of southern Minnesota.
Yeah, that was kind of the type of hunting that I grew up around, was that one. So it's kind of always interesting to hear about other people's experiences in the Midwest with the types of hunting and things that they do.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't hunt anymore, but what do you think kind of kept drawing you to that activity in all of the different areas that you've lived?
I'd say there's kind of a couple a couple different things that draws me to hunting. One of those being that it's just a great way, a different way to interact with the outdoors rather than kind of my other hobbies of hiking and backpacking and camping and cross-country skiing and snowshoeing. And it's just a different way to interact with the outdoors. For me, whenever I'm hiking or backpacking, every time I see like a wildlife track or deer track or rabbit, I just love it. I mean, I absolutely love searching for wildlife tracks in the outdoors, and it's just something I do on my own, not even through hunting. So that's one aspect that I could follow game trails and wildlife tracks all day, every day. I mean, it's just a ton of fun to walk through the woods and just see what is happening, what animals are moving through the landscape. You can kind of read the tracks, and it tells a story of what's happening and what they're doing and their movements and their mannerisms. And you come across like a rabbit track, and then shortly thereafter there's a little fox or coyote track following, and you can see kind of what's going on, and it just tells a story. So that's one aspect of hunting that I really enjoy. And it's also another great way to kind of expand on my outdoor skills and my outdoor knowledge and use them and apply them in a different manner. And I learn every time I'm out in the woods hunting. I mean, I learn something, and I've made multiple mistakes. Even this last November, I spooked quite a few deer, and it was my first time out solo hunting by myself. And I go, I learned something new there. Shouldn't have done that, or could have improved here, could have done that differently, should have looked at that different. So it's always a way to expand on my skills. And for me, there's one moment that keeps me coming back to hunting it's my favorite absolute moment, and it lasts for like 5-10 minutes max. And it's right before sunrise, and the sun hasn't popped up yet, but the forest is just starting to light up, and you can start to pick out tree branches and tree stumps and just little things around the forest. And it's kind of like you're just sitting there, nothing around you knows that you're there, and you're just observing. And you're just watching the forest wake up. And you don't get to experience that in any other outdoor activity that I have found so far. Just sitting and observing and watching the birds wake up for the first time and kind of like rustle their feathers, the frost off their feathers, on a cold November morning. The squirrels start to run around and forage, and a little bit of a breeze come through the trees. It's just awesome. I mean, I'm just smiling, even just picturing myself sitting in the woods at that moment, because it's just wonderful. It's not to say cliche, but it's like magical. It's just, you don't get to experience that in any other activity, because you're moving through the landscape, hiking and backpacking and mountain biking. You're moving through it. You're not just sitting still and observing for hours on end of what's happening around you. And that's my favorite moment. That's what keeps me coming back. And I'd say the last thing is why I do it, what draws me to it, is that it's a great way for me to provide for myself and to harvest an animal and to provide food and subsistence for myself. So yeah, it's kind of multifaceted.
Yeah.
But those are some of the reasons why I do it and why I enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your description of the forest waking up and everything like that, because I feel like a lot of the sportsmen that I know that practice more, I guess, sustainable hunting practices, they more so describe it as like an integration into the ecosystem. Like you become a part of that ecosystem, yeah. Whereas like you're saying the other activities, probably a lot of us also enjoy, you are just passing through. You're not necessarily becoming a part, which I guess some people might feel that way when they're doing some of those things, but I do think it kind of takes on a different element for sure.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I've had some like experiences, where you have chickadees or birds land, on your shoulder or on the end of your rifle, or my dad had an owl fly straight at him, had no idea he was there. I had a coyote walk down 100 yards out in front of me in November, this last season, had no idea I was there, and so it's just, you get to see things and observe things in just in a new way, and it's pretty awesome.
So you kind of mentioned also that you do it as a way to provide yourself with sustenance. And that's something that I have heard a lot before as well from other hunters. So how do you think that you kind of integrate that lifestyle in terms of sustainability and hunting?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So something that was not like ingrained into us, but something that we just a part of our life growing up, was that we didn't really eat much beef. Like we knew where our food was coming from. We always knew where our food was coming from. And we always had venison available to us because my dad spent every fall hunting. It was always, you could say locally sourced. It was within a 10 to 20 mile radius of where we live. And so that's something that for me has always brought value to my life, in knowing that I know where my food is coming from. I know where this meat is coming from. I know the animal, what it was eating, where it's been raised, the habitat conditions. It's, our current food system essentially in food industry is we don't really know exactly where this is coming from or how it was raised or how it was treated or, any other background information on it. Where with hunting, you're putting the hard work in and you're sourcing your food yourself. It takes a lot of work, but it's worth it, and there's value in that, to know where your food is coming from. And so that's something that I hold dear to my heart, and something that I know that means a lot to my father as well, and something that he could give to us. Was he did it himself. He put the hard work in, and he knows where this food is coming from.
It's somewhat akin, I guess, to if you're growing your own food in a garden, or if you're raising your own chickens and collecting the eggs or something. Like, you are a part of that food production process, as opposed to just going to buy, I don't know, a tube of that slime that is ground beef in the grocery store.
Which is like 40% of, ground beef, and the other part is just who knows, It's so something that kind of I had touched on was that it was once my father would come home, with a deer, it was all hands on deck. And so we would help process and quarter the deer and then grind it and then package it. And so every fall, and every time we got a deer, the kitchen table became our processing area. And so everybody had their own project, and somebody would weigh out 2 pounds, somebody would wrap it, somebody would label it, and it just moved around the table, and all 5 of us were sitting around the table helping process our food for the winter and for the rest of the year. So yeah, there's a lot of value in that, and I'm really appreciative of my father and my family for giving me that, at a young age.
Yeah, and I think it kind of just brings it back to that connectivity to the land that you were talking about earlier too, because it is such an intimate pursuit, killing an animal is. Then I feel like you have, I don't want to say more of a connection, but at least a better respect for what nature is providing to you. You're not so far removed that it's just taken for granted.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would say the other thing to mention is that, when we do harvest an animal, we use the entire animal. We use everything that we can use. Nothing goes to waste. And that's out of respect for the animal. And so using the back straps and the tenderloins and the heart and the liver and using everything that you possibly can is something that we've always done. And I know a lot of hunters follow suit in that same manner, just out of respect for the animal. And then we also donate the hide after. And so there's programs, Hides for Habitat, and you can donate the hide, and then those hides are sold to be made for apparel or for fur traders, essentially, and then that money is put into the habitat restoration program, so back into the landscape. So it's kind of full circle system there as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I have become more aware of, I guess, in the last few years is how much hunters and anglers really do contribute to that type of conservation. I should have made the connection at a younger age because my grandfather is a conservationist and a sportsman, but I just started learning more about that direct input into conservation and like preserving the public lands. And another question is, do you think, because you also participate in other outdoor activities beyond just hunting and stuff, so do you think that there could be a better crossover between those worlds?
So this is something that I have always said, and it's something I firmly believe, is that hunting and fishing and sportsmen in general have been kind of the backbone of the outdoor industry, and historically have been, and currently are. It's in the process of transitioning within the last few years, kind of as we've seen a boom in the outdoor recreation industry, and everybody is getting outdoors and starting new hobbies and starting new outdoor activities and expanding out from their normal places. And so now the big question is, okay, it's kind of like, how do we have everybody kind of equally contribute? And so it's not just on the back of, hunters and fishermen. I do think that there needs to be more of kind of a more equal contribution from other outdoor recreationists. And we're all out there because we love the outdoors, so why not help contribute to kind of the landscape and the programs that help protect it and maintain it? There have been some positive changes, and I'll just speak on kind of Minnesota and Colorado because those are the two that I know the most about and keep up on. But Colorado in the last 2 years, I think they started it in 2020, was, so there's state wildlife areas throughout Colorado, and they're managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And those state wildlife areas are essentially established and maintained for hunting and fishing purposes primarily, and for wildlife breeding seasons and migration as well. And so those are what those were created for. And so in the last few years, there's been a lot of people expanding out and using them for hiking and mountain biking and camping and all sorts of different activities. And it's like, well, they're trying to figure out kind of a way for everybody to kind of contribute equally. And so it's not just the hunters and fishermen that are paying, their fees through the hunting and fishing license fees to maintain that. So they started the first year, the program they started was you had to have a hunting or fishing license to use that land, essentially. It didn't go over as well with the outdoor recreation industry per se and the people, because they're like, well, we don't fish. Why should we buy a hunting or fishing license? So then this last year they started an SWA, a state wildlife area pass, kind of like a state or a state park pass, essentially. And so that, I think, is just the verbiage, and the process has gone over a little bit better. And so that's what they're saying to do, just specifically in those state wildlife areas. So that has been kind of a new thing that they've started. Currently, Minnesota and the Department of Natural Resources is accepting public input and kind of brainstorming some ideas for essentially not like a backpack tax, but like a sporting goods tax. How can we make sure that everybody contributes to the outdoors in a financial manner equally? And making sure that it's still accessible for all. Slapping a tax on something might inhibit someone from getting the outdoors because they can't afford it, to a certain extent. And so they want to make sure that it's even across the board. Everybody can contribute. Everybody is involved. And so currently that's what Minnesota is doing in the Department of Natural Resources. One other thing I could mention is that Texas in 1993 started a sporting goods tax. And they didn't create a new tax. They basically took their sales tax, a portion of their sales tax, from any sporting good product. And now it's like up to 94% of that sales tax that they can pull. And that goes back into like their state parks and trail maintenance. And it goes back into their state. It's been really successful. There's a variety of different programs and a variety of different approaches that can be done. And so it's the big thing that people are talking about this last few years is, okay, well, how do we do this, and how do we approach it so that it's not just on hunters and fishermen? They're not the only ones kind of pulling the weight here.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think people just aren't necessarily aware of where the funding is actually coming from to upkeep those public areas. And hunting specifically, I would say, gets kind of a bad rap for, different reasons in different communities. And that is an interesting, perception to me, because they're the ones holding up all of these open areas for all the other people to recreate, and they're kind of the ones being blamed for other random things. So there's like a disconnect of what is actually occurring in the different communities. But it is good to hear that there are models that are being built that are somewhat effective. Like the one in Colorado seems really interesting to me that you brought up, because people seem very willing to pay for permits and passes like that if they are using the land frequently.
Yeah, there's some big changes happening, and I think just because it's kind of being brought to attention, and there's so many more people in the outdoors, and it's kind of like, okay, well, a lot of state agencies or governmental agencies, even nonprofits, are kind of like, well, we don't have the funding, we don't have the money to continue to maintain these trails, or to continue for the habitat restoration programs, or so it's kind of like we need to come up with some other way, and then how do we do that? And so there's some really positive things that are happening, and then I'm just hoping that it'll continue.
It is really like wishful thinking to just believe that maybe people will volunteer their time or donate enough money to conservation, but that if that was the case, those nonprofits would not have to exist. And
part of me for buying a hunting and fishing license, buy a fishing license every single year. And sometimes I only go out once or twice, it just depending on schedule, or I'm, where I'm at and what I'm doing and stuff, but I still like to do it every now and then. But I like knowing that money is going back into wildlife conservation or habitat restoration. It's something that I do enjoy, and I've made just personal donations to Colorado Parks and Wildlife on my own, and just because I believe in what they're doing and I want to help support them as much as I can.
So one thing that I've also noticed, especially growing up in a rural community, that the main outdoor sport is hunting or fishing or something like that, that people were involved, women were involved, and girls were involved when they were young. Like, I went out with my grandpa when I was in high school, kind of like how you're talking about, or even from a younger age, but then it kind of like fell off. And so how do you feel in general the standing of women representation in that type of outdoor sport is happening right now?
Yeah, I think that there have been a lot of women getting into hunting in recent years, and I think it's awesome. I think there should be more women that hunt and fish, and I follow a lot of women fly fishermen organizations, and I haven't seen necessarily as much hunting, but I know that there's a lot of a drive for it. There's a need for it, in the outdoor or hunting industry wants more women to be in the outdoors. And I think about this often. If I didn't grow up in hunting or fishing, if I didn't have somebody in my life like my father that passed down his passion, would I ever get into hunting? Like if I didn't have any introduction to it. And it's something I think about. I don't know necessarily if I would, because for me growing up, it was normal. It was something that was involved in my life consistently, and I was exposed to consistently. I was fortunate enough to learn from someone, who had the skills and the knowledge. And so, yeah, I think it can be an intimidating field to break into, especially if, you don't have or know anything about, guns or rifles or bow and arrow, like whatever style of hunting you want to get into. It can be intimidating. A couple organizations, and I'm trying to think, state agencies and that are starting to establish like women clinics, women only hunting or firearm safety groups. I've seen a lot of progress in that industry, in the last 5+ years. You still don't see that many women in the outdoor industry, hunting and fishing. And,
why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think you kind of have to have somebody show, be exposed to it necessarily. If you didn't have somebody that you grew up with to teach you how to hunt and fish, and would you go out and do it yourself? Mm-hmm. And so it takes a lot of dedication. It takes a lot of patience. And so, yeah, I don't know if you weren't exposed to it at a young age. I think maybe that's the factor. Obviously, like northern Minnesota and Minnesota people, and, I'm sure other rural small towns, it revolves around hunting and fishing. Mm-hmm. So women that grew up in smaller towns and more rural areas, more accustomed to that lifestyle. So if you weren't raised, around it, could be intimidating to break into.
That makes a lot of sense. And I suppose in comparison to other types of outdoor recreation, it does have a higher barrier to entry in terms of not only knowledge, but gear as well. And then there's that big safety piece if you are traveling out by yourself or if you're handling weapons of any kind. And I do think that hunting in general is really often viewed as like a masculine endeavor. Like even if you think of egalitarian societies and their hunting and gathering and stuff, like in our minds we often think, oh, well, the men are the hunters, and that's not always the case historically. So it's just an interesting societal perception that men should be gravitating more towards hunting, whereas like women also have that same skill set and drive and capability to be able to pursue those sports.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember like growing up, hunting with my younger brother and my dad, and I remember my dad mentioning that I was the better hunter because I had more patience. I could sit still longer, and my brother was just restless and he just couldn't sit in the stand for hours on end, where I could sit there for 4-5 hours and watch and observe, and I was tuned into what was around me. So yeah, I remember him making that comment growing up of just like kind of do better in a stand, necessarily if that's you're a better hunter, but you do better in that situation. I'm just very lucky that my father had a passion for it and passed it down to me. Mm-hmm. And I think every father, or even, women or mother who hunts as well should pass that on to their children too, because it's such a neat experience to be just out in the woods with your family. And it's not necessarily about taking a life or harvesting an animal, but just the experience in general it's just fun. It's just a great experience, and it's something I treasure and value.
Yeah, and especially the type of hunting that you're doing, from I guess my experiences when I was younger, but also talking to other people, is that even if you're not actually, I guess, having a quote unquote successful hunt, it is still about that experience and being a part of that landscape and tracking that animal and understanding the ecosystem. So if there are people listening that are interested in hunting, especially a more holistic, sustainable version of hunting where you are really hunting to eat. You're not necessarily hunting for the sport of it or because you think it's cool and like guns or something like that. It is more for sustenance and you want a better connection to the land and where your food is coming from. You kind of mentioned a few resources, but do you know any other ones that would be good for people that didn't have that exposure at such a young age? The only one I know of is Hunt to Eat, that organization.
Yeah, I was trying to think off the top of my head, kind of what I would recommend for anybody trying to break into, the hunting world. First, kind of start local, start small, and take a hunter safety course or a firearm safety course, if you're not familiar with firearms or bow and arrow, whatever weapon that you want to use. But that's where I would start so that you can at least get the basics, because safety is number one priority in hunting. And so if you kind of start from those base kind of fundamentals, then you can take it with you as you continue to grow and gain some knowledge in the hunting atmosphere. But try to find maybe like a local hunting group in your area. Read magazines and books. I know there's multiple hunting magazines. The pages are just filled full of information, but start small, maybe even book a trip with like an outfitter or a guide and just see how it goes from that first experience, and then you can branch out and start doing it on your own. As for like organizations, I know there's just state wildlife agencies and kind of Department of Natural Resources starting to create these women clinics. And so I would just kind of hop on whatever state you live in and look up their courses, events, and just see what they're holding, whether it's online, virtual or in person. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe, I feel like, at least for me, online communities have been really important personally and professionally. And that could be really anywhere, like, I don't know, LinkedIn, Facebook, if there's other platforms that you gravitate towards. And I am sure that there are hunting groups that are there to help connect people and help you network and possibly even find a mentor in your area. Because I feel like mentorship as an adult, if you're entering the world of hunting, would be really valuable.
For some reason, I can't think of the name. There's Sisters on the Fly for like fly fishing, casting for recovery, and I'm trying to think of some hunting ones that would be beneficial. For some reason, they're not coming to my mind off the top of my head.
That's okay. I'm sure you can search online for those types of things, or even there's tons of outdoor rec informational pages on Instagram of people to follow, and I know a lot of those people put on clinics of different varieties. So there are options out there for people that are looking for that type of thing. But is there anything else specific that you kind of wanted to add, or how can people get in contact with you or kind of follow your story as you go?
Yeah, so if anyone wants to contact me or reach out, at www.kallihawkins.com. You can find me on social, Instagram, Facebook, just at Kalli Hawkins. Yeah, I think that would be the best way, and then you can contact me through email through either of those sources as well. So I don't know if I necessarily have much else to add. I feel like we covered, everything at least. I just want to say thanks for having me on, and I really appreciate you wanting to learn a little bit more about hunting and kind of share it with your podcast community as well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. It was really fun, and I do feel like I learned a lot. Well, I just want to say thank you again to Kalli for taking the time to be on the show and share her love of deer hunting with all of us. And I also want to mention that I have been doing a few intro to different types of fishing and hunting, and I would be really open to learning more about the different facets of that, as well as other outdoor sports. So if you feel like you are someone that really loves that activity, it could be quail hunting, it could be bow hunting, any of those aspects, and you could share how people can get involved in that in a sustainable way, shoot me an email. And you can find my contact information on theoutdoorminimalist.com. All of the different organizations, social channels, and links that Kalli shared in the episode, I will also be putting in the show notes, so you can check that out there. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Starting Monday, February 7th, new content will begin to appear on the Outdoor Minimalist Patreon. Head over to theoutdoorminimalist.com for more information about our listener support and patron exclusives. You can still find me on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book. Follow there for daily updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.